Welcome to day 2 of the Spooktacular. I have a special treat for you today. It has been a little while since I've done a reading of a story here on YouTube, so I will be reading a story called Breadcrumbs. It is my latest story. I wrote it this year and it was published in an anthology called Once Upon a Bite. And this theme of this whole anthology was bite. So it could be vampires or any other aspect of a wolf's bite or, anything like that. And so I thought how perfect to do Hansel and Gretel, where the bite is candy, but also adding a little vampire touch to it instead of a witch. So we all know this story from growing up, that two children follow breadcrumbs through the woods, right? And then the breadcrumbs get eaten by birds, and so they can't find their way home. They get caught by a witch because they're eating her candy house, and they are afraid they're going to get eaten up, gobbled up by her, but instead they end up pushing her into the oven and they are saved. Now, the original Hansel and Gretel story is much darker than that. So mine takes a little bit of a dark turn as well, and it was super fun to kind of reimagine Hansel and Gretel hundreds of years after this event with the witch in the woods and what has happened to them, what has become of them since then. So this is a little bit slight deviation from my norm of YA with no cussing at all in it. There's no not dropping any F-bombs here, but I will just give a slight warning that there is some mildly cursing language in this. There's also some dance clubs and, things that might not be appropriate for super small children. So you might want to put headphones on if you have littles around or impressionable preteens that you might not want to read this. It's not rated X or anything, but it might be slightly PG-13. So just a little warning there as you get started. But I really hope you enjoy this story. So this is Breadcrumbs, and I'm excited to read it for you. Not until tonight. Everyone thinks it was a witch we faced in those woods, but she wasn't a witch. She was a vampire. And we didn't push her into the oven the way those children's stories will have you believe. We burned her to death in the light of the sun. I dragged her out there with my own bare hands at the age of 8. It wasn't a house made of candy that lured us in either. It was a simple mouthful handed to us by a man we trusted. A man I hadn't seen in nearly 200 years. Not until tonight. At first, I wasn't even sure if it was him or just another shadow inside my brain. My mind had been playing tricks like that on me for as long as I could remember. I would be sitting in a restaurant laughing with my friends when the tilt of someone's head would catch the corner of my eye and my entire body would stiffen. My heart would race and my mouth would fill with cotton. But then I would gather the courage to actually turn my head and look, only to find every single time that it wasn't him at all, just some random person who'd moved in a way that had once been so familiar to me. It must have happened 1,000 times over the past 2 centuries, so much that I'd become numb to it, sometimes not even bothering to confirm his non-existence because some part of me was so damn tired of wanting it to be him. And at the same time, I was terrified that someday it would be him, that he'd be there, the man with all the answers, and I would be too scared to demand them, too scared to even face the truth. Mags, what's wrong with you? You look like you just saw a ghost. Landy touched my arm playfully. If she only knew. Was he a ghost? Or was he immortal like me? Maggie. She grabbed my wrist this time, shaking it back and forth. Hello, Earth to Maggie. Maggie. I hardly recognized that name. I'd never been Maggie back then. Margaret Ann, though my mother had always preferred the nickname Gretel. That's who I had always been, 200 years as Gretel. But I'd stopped using that name the day my brother Hansel disappeared, almost 2 full years ago now. Had it really been that long? Without him, I wasn't myself anymore. After 6 months of wandering around, completely lost, I decided the only way to save my sanity was to become someone new, someone without a bloody past and the skills to take down an entire hive of vampires in a single evening. That's when I decided to call myself Maggie and live my life as if I were a normal human. And so far, it hadn't been half bad, if I was being honest. But the past and its shadows always followed me. The past didn't care if I'd changed my name or dyed my honey blonde hair black as a raven. The second I saw that man, Wolfgang, I'd become Gretel again, an 8-year-old girl being led through the woods with the promise of a big surprise. Without even thinking, I reached for my dagger, only to remember I didn't carry weapons like that anymore. "Holy shit, Maggie, are you even hearing me?" Landy asked, shaking my shoulders now and motioning to someone nearby. For a second, I'd forgotten she was talking to me. All I could think about was the man who'd just disappeared into a hallway near the back of the club. Could it really be him this time? "What's she on?" Vic asked, lifting his finger to my eye. "She didn't eat any of that candy they were passing out, did she?" I grabbed his wrist so quickly he jumped about a mile high before pulling away, a terrified look on his face. "What candy?" I asked. Landy gave me a questioning look as she reached into the pocket of her tiny black shorts. "You got one too, remember?" She handed out a large piece of candy wrapped in glittering gold foil. "That girl was passing them out as we walked in." "Please tell me you didn't eat one of those things," Vic said, rubbing his wrist, "because I heard from one of my friends that it's laced with something weird, like she took one last week and woke up 3 days later with a massive hangover and literally no memory of what happened to her." "That's just an urban legend," Landy said, rolling her eyes and unwrapping the candy. "No one is giving out free drugs that make you forget your life. People pay too much for that kind of trip. It's probably just pure sugar." She started to put the purple candy in her mouth, but the sight of its shimmering surface made my stomach lurch. I knocked it to the floor and stomped it to pieces with the heel of my boot. "What the hell did you do that for?" I stared down at the broken candy and shuddered. The wrapper had certainly gotten an upgrade, but the candy itself was nearly identical. "If that's actually free drugs, you owe me big time," she said. "You know what kind of a week I've had. I deserve to have a good time tonight." "No good time to be had down there. I can promise you that," I said. It had been a long time since I'd seen candy like that, but the kind of betrayal that followed sort of made it impossible to forget. It was meant to be a treat, he'd said. A treat for being such good kids. It wasn't until afterward that I remembered how nervous he'd seemed, how he kept looking over his shoulder as he led us into the woods. And we'd trusted him with all our hearts. We loved our Uncle Wolfgang and Aunt Lydia as if they were our own parents. We'd been happy in their home after our mother died. We felt like a real family. In my mind's eye, I could still remember the cottage we lived in on the edge of the village like it was yesterday. I shook the memories out of my brain as a strong, warm hand clasped my own and gently pulled me forward. "Hey, are you okay?" Cole, back from the bar with 2 drinks cradled in his other hand as he pulled me closer. "What's going on? How can I help?" he asked, his warm brown eyes searching mine as I looked up. The concern in his voice was so sincere, it nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. Despite the fact that we'd been dating for months, I hadn't realized just how much he cared until that moment. Or maybe it was the fact that I cared that surprised me so much. No one but my brother Hansel had ever cared about me, and when he disappeared, I assumed no one ever would again. Part of me wanted to rest my head against Cole's chest and tell him it was nothing, to forget the past and the man who'd betrayed me. But I knew better. Peace was not possible for someone like me. I shifted my weight and a piece of candy crunched under the heel of my boot. Purple, shimmering candy. What were they doing passing it out in a club like this? And what did my uncle have to do with all of it? I looked around the club, seeing beyond myself and my questions now. This was bigger than me or Hansel. Everyone in this club was danger, including my new set of friends. This was bigger than me or Hansel. Everyone in this club was in danger, including my new set of friends. None of them were qualified to figure it out, though. Not like I was. So I had a choice. I could grab Cole's hand, leave this club, and never look back. I could just be Maggie, a normal woman trying to live a normal life. Or I could follow the shadows that still haunted me, searching for answers to the questions I knew damn well I'd never stop asking. And maybe I'd manage to save a few lives in the process. If Hansel were here, there wouldn't even be a question of what to do. He'd have already tracked Wolfgang down and had him nailed to the wall. I'm fine, I managed, squeezing Cole's hand before pulling away. I just have to go talk to someone real quick. I'll be right back. Maggie, wait, he called, his voice fading as I slipped between the bodies packed on the dance floor. Now that I'd made up my mind, I moved quickly, zeroing in on the spot where I'd last seen the man who looked like Uncle Wolfgang. Part of me hoped I'd find the guy, only to realize it wasn't him at all, just some rando with a familiar face. But it was different this time, and I knew it in my ancient bones. Hansel and I had always suspected Wolfgang was immortal like we were, but there was, of course, no way to prove it. By the time we'd killed the vampire and stumbled back through the woods to find our way home, Aunt Lydia, our mother's sister, was dead, and Wolfgang was long gone. No one in the village knew what had happened to him. He'd simply disappeared. We'd spent centuries looking for him, and it wasn't fair that I may have just found him when Hansel was gone. As I reached the dark hallway where I'd seen him last, though, I cursed my own hesitation and doubt. I should have run after him right away. How could I have been so dumb? I searched the area, realizing soon enough that there were only 2 ways out of this back room and hallway. He could have either come back through the dance floor area, which I would have noticed, or he went through a door labeled "Do Not Enter." Without hesitation this time, I pushed through the door, realizing too late that it led to the alley behind the club. The door slammed behind me, locking before I could catch it, and suddenly the darkness seemed to close in. Shadows moved around me, despite the fact that I seemed to be completely alone, without a weapon. Good going, Gretel. I mean, I knew I was out of practice, but this was embarrassing. Seeing Wolfgang here had obviously rattled me, but now I wondered if that had been the plan all along. A shadowy figure to my right began to materialize, and I prepared my stance. Weapons or not, I was in it now. I'd survived worse. My body tensed, ready to fight, when the door behind me opened and the encroaching shadows dissipated in an instant. Cole stood there, concern in his dark eyes. He shook his head. "What's going on with you, Maggie?" he asked, holding the door open. "There's no one out here." "Not anymore," I muttered as I slipped under his arm and pulled him back inside the club before the shadows could follow us. I shuddered as something brushed against my bare leg just before the door closed us off from the darkness of night. Chapter 2. Who I Was Born to Be. I couldn't sleep. Instead, I must have sat in bed just twirling that golden-wrapped candy in my fingers for a straight hour. It had no identifying marks, no logo, nothing that would indicate who created it or where I could find them. It had been nearly 200 years since I'd seen our uncle, 2 centuries since I'd held a candy exactly like this one in my hands. And yet, it was so familiar I could almost taste it on my tongue. So, an identical candy to the one Wolfgang gave us that night, and a man who looked just like Wolfgang disappearing into a dark alley that was obviously occupied by vampires? There was no way this was a coincidence. But why now? Hansel and I had spent most of our immortal lives looking for any sign of our uncle, and though we had captured and interrogated many vampires along the way, no one had admitted to knowing him or who he worked for. In the end, we'd simply given in to the fact that our uncle must have worked for the vampire who tried to kill us in that house in the woods. How he'd met her or why he'd betrayed us that way was still a mystery. But we'd run out of breadcrumbs to follow. We'd spent a month in that vampire's house, living through unspeakable horror my young mind had mostly managed to block. We were her prisoners, and for a while, we'd thought that was going to be the worst of it. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. We'd overheard her talking to a visitor one afternoon about plans for our blood, that we were special in some way. She'd planned to sell me to another vampire for an outrageous sum of money and keep Hansel there for herself. Living through the horror of that house was bad enough when we had each other, but Hansel and I knew we'd never survive it if we were separated. It would have been unbearable. So we came up with a plan to trick the old woman, making our move the next time she dared to approach our cage. Hours later, when she was nothing more than ashes on the ground, we got our first real look at the inside of that house. The vampire had been making candy like the ones Wolfgang had given to us, like the one I now held in my hands. Back then, we'd taken what we thought we could use from that house and burned the rest, destroying what was left of the candy. But apparently someone else knew the recipe. Someone who'd resurfaced after all this time so they could start drugging innocent people again. It had to be Wolfgang, and for some reason he was working with those vampires. I could only imagine what a group of powerful vampires with access to an unlimited supply of blood could do to this world. They would be unstoppable and more dangerous than any hive my brother and I had ever faced. The question now was whether I was strong enough to face them alone. Tonight's little alley incident proved just how out of practice I was these days, and not just out of practice, but out of sorts. Back when Hansel was alive, I never would have just followed a suspected enemy into a dark alley without a weapon. It was stupid and reckless, and if it hadn't been for Cole, I might have died. Or worse. Beside me, Cole rolled over. I used the movement to slide out of bed without waking him and carefully tiptoed toward the closet. I glanced back at him just to make sure he was still sound asleep, and when I was certain he had settled, I disappeared into the large closet and removed a panel along the back wall behind a row of my dresses. A long black box hid in the shadows of the makeshift hiding place, and my hands trembled slightly as I reached for it, flinching as the strange symbols lit up on the keypad. I had hoped to never need this stuff again. Hell, maybe I didn't need it now. Maybe I didn't want to get back into this after all this time. I had a great guy in there who, despite my awkwardness and mostly distant attitude, really seemed to care about me. I had friends for the first time in my life. I had a decent paying job that, admittedly, was torturously boring. Somehow, though, there was a level of comfort in the boring parts. I'd never had a normal life before this, and despite missing my brother more than words could express, I was starting to get used to normal. And how do you see that playing out in 10 or 20 years, Gretel? Hansel's voice popped into my head as if he were standing right there. I swatted him away, like that was going to make any difference. I'll figure it out when we get there, I muttered. But it wasn't like I'd never thought of that before. Of course, it crept into my thoughts almost daily. Anytime Cole mentioned us having a future beyond this weekend, I clammed up. He seemed to think it was because I'd been hurt before and was scared of commitment. What he didn't have any damn clue about was the fact that in 50 years he'd be an old man, but me, I'd be exactly the same. Never aging, never dying, not by any natural causes anyway. I ran my hand across the black leather of the case. Who was I kidding? There was no normal future for me. I'd managed to play this role for over a year. I'd tried on an identity like trying on a piece of clothing. Maggie Miller. But I was delusional if I thought it would last or that I could ever really be anyone else but who I was born to be. Besides, my life had been messed up since that day Uncle Wolfgang had given me a piece of strange candy and lured me into a vampire's lair. I was never meant to come out of that house normal. But there were a lot of people in the city who still had a chance at a good life. People who'd been handed a piece of candy just like this one lately, thinking it was relatively harmless. And then what? Vic said his friend had woken up with no recollection of what had happened to her, but I had a pretty good idea of what must have happened. Vampires were having more and more trouble surviving in the modern era of the internet where literally everyone had a news camera in their hand. It was difficult to murder en masse and get away with it for very long. So, despite the fact that there were more humans on Earth than ever before, the vampires were hungrier than they'd ever been. Reduced to roadkill and blood banks, they were having to get creative with their food supply. I twirled the golden-wrapped candy in my hand, trying to piece it all together. Unsuspecting singles in the club, already prone to overindulgence and reckless behavior, get a free piece of Lux candy. Hearing that it might be a free way to get high, they eat it. Once the drug takes over, they're taken to a vampire's lair here in the city, where they become temporary vamp food. A few days later, before they die or get too weak to recover, they're taken home and left to wonder what trouble they got into along the way. As far as plants go, it wasn't half bad. Truth be told, it was a lot more humane than the old school vampires' plans of feeding until every human around was dead. Still, vampires weren't exactly known for their ability to hold back when it came to feasting on human blood. Even if they intended to keep the humans they kidnapped alive, they were bound to go too far every once in a while. No one was safe while this candy was being distributed in our city, and no one had the ability to take care of it the way I did. I entered the code into the backlit panel on the black case and winced as it popped open. It was louder than I remembered, and I leaned over to peek into the bedroom just to be sure it hadn't woken Cole up. I definitely didn't want to have to explain why I had a black case full of guns, daggers, and pointy objects in my closet. It didn't seem like he'd moved, though, so for now I was still safe. I should have had him sleep at his own place tonight, but truth be told, I didn't want to be alone. I actually loved having him around, though I hadn't gotten up the nerve to admit that to him yet. He had a calming influence over me that I liked. He made me feel safe. So, what exactly was I doing here, sitting in my closet in the middle of the night, staring at a cache of weapons? I ran my hand over the blades of my daggers with a soft touch, as if they were precious, sacred. I realized with a start that I'd missed them. I lifted a silver dagger into my hand and wrapped my fingers around its hilt, closing my eyes as the memories of all those years of hunting with my brother came rushing back. I'd managed to do a better job than I thought of blocking it all out over the past year and a half, but in an instant, those same feelings were back. Gretel was back. And as I thought about the innocent people in those clubs and the malevolence out there preying on them, I knew that while Maggie was enjoying her somewhat normal existence, Gretel could never turn her back on this. "Babe?" Cole's voice from the next room, the rustle of covers. "Shit," I muttered, throwing the dagger back into the case and snapping it closed. I quickly pulled a dress down from the hangers above and threw it over the top of the case as I stood, my body blocking the closet as Cole appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing up so late?" he asked, rubbing his eyes and looking into the closet. I put my hands on his chest and urged him backwards. "I don't know, just couldn't sleep," I said. He narrowed his eyes, glancing behind me and shaking his head. I caught the start of a curious smile on his lips before he turned around and started toward the kitchen. It couldn't be more than 4 a.m. "Wait, where are you going?" "I'm making tea," he said. "That's the only thing that ever helps you sleep." My heart literally melted in my chest. Why, after everything, did he have to be so good to me? Why was it always that we found something wonderful just as we realized it could never be ours? I turned back to the closet, shoving the case back in its hiding place, and went to join my boyfriend in the kitchen, knowing that as soon as the sun came up, everything would change for us. I was going back to my old life, which was the one place he could never follow. Chapter 3, A Trail to Follow. Over the next week, I went to the club every night, not to dance or to party. I went to watch. No one offered me any strange candies for the first 5 nights I was there, and I caught no sign of the man who'd destroyed my life all those years ago. Nothing unusual at all, in fact, and I went home each night feeling frustrated and slightly insane. Had I invented this whole thing? Was I stepping back into an unhealthy obsession after nearly 2 years of fighting for a new life? Cole had been calling me for days, and I'd basically told him I needed some space. Distancing myself from him had nearly broken my heart, and if I didn't find some sign of Wolfgang or vampire activity soon, I was going to pick up that phone and tell Cole I was sorry. One more night, I told myself. If there was no sign after that, I would give it up. Try to go back to the normal life I'd at least temporarily carved out for myself in this crazy world. But my destiny wasn't about to let that happen. On the 6th night, a young, beautiful woman in skin-tight black dress came up to me at the bar and slipped a golden-wrapped candy into my hand with a wink. "Wait," I said, touching her arm as she turned away. Her skin was ice cold, which should have come as no surprise. She pulled away but kept a smile on her face. "Just try it," she said softly, leaning in. "What is it?" I asked. An eyebrow popped up and her smile brightened. I could practically see her incisors grow as she thought about the bloodfest waiting for everyone she convinced to try that candy. "It's a gateway to the best night of your life," she said. "Trust me." I wanted to ask her more, but she'd already moved on to another woman further down the bar, and I didn't want to draw too much attention to myself. Not yet, anyway. I turned the candy around under the light a few times, searching for any kind of mark or logo, but again, there was nothing. No clue or sign of who had created it or where I could find them. But that was okay. I had what I needed now anyway. I smiled as I thought of my brother and his trails of white breadcrumbs, so he wouldn't get lost in the woods without a way home. Our mother had given him a magical pouch one year for his birthday, the summer before she died. That pouch contained 100 smooth white pebbles, each with the letter H engraved in gold on one side. They'd replaced his breadcrumbs, and we'd used those pebbles for years as we explored the woods outside our village. I no longer had Hansel or his magic pebbles, but what I did have was a trail to follow. I looked at the woman as she slid another candy in the hand of a handsome guy standing at the edge of the dance floor. It took a few hours for the action at the club to slow down, but the mysterious woman kept passing out candies all evening. She seemed to mostly target singles out alone. Every once in a while, she'd give the candy to all the women in a small group of friends or a man on his own, but most of the candy went to young women standing by themselves. I watched carefully, waiting for someone to take the bait and actually eat the candy. A surprising number of people, despite being promised the night of their lives, just threw the candy into their bag or pocket without a second glance. The smart ones left the candy on the bar top or threw it in the trash. But one young woman in a purple dress sat at the bar, moving it between her fingers for a few minutes before shrugging, unwrapping it, and popping it into her mouth. Her eyes widened and she nodded, so I took that to mean it tasted as nice as it looked. My own mouth watered slightly as I remembered the taste of that purple candy. Sweet, yes, but it was more than that. It was exquisite. Perfection. Seductive, even though that's not a word I would have understood back then. The woman in the purple dress closed her eyes as if to savor it. My stomach tightened, and I had to look away for a moment. It had been almost 2 centuries since I'd tasted that candy, and yet I still remembered it so acutely. I could smell the sickly grape scent of it in my nostrils. When I finally collected myself, the woman had made her way to the dance floor, hands up and dreamily slow dancing despite the fast house beat. People bumped into her, moved past her, stared at her, and none of that seemed to penetrate the euphoria she was experiencing. She'd left the club and entered her own little world, it seemed. I knew that feeling, only I hadn't been a 20-something adult back then. I was only 8 years old. One minute, I was dancing just like that in the forest, twirling around and feeling certain that snow was falling onto my cheeks. The next, I was waking up, who knows how much later, trapped inside a wooden cage in the basement of a vampire's lair. I took a deep breath, hoping to calm my racing heart. I'd come here for exactly this, but now that I was seeing her reaction and knew what was planned for her, I felt like that child again, reaching for my brother's hand in solidarity. Only this time, he wasn't there. A tear ran down my cheek and I brushed it away quickly, glancing around to make sure no one had been paying any attention to me. Hansel would have been ashamed of me, standing here feeling sorry for myself. Over the years, we'd taught ourselves how to feel nothing but anger and to focus only on justice and revenge. Maybe it was because I'd loosened my grip on who I used to be, because I'd allowed someone human and normal into my heart and my bed. I'd gone soft, and soft was not going to get me anywhere with the vampires I was likely to face later tonight. I had to be strong, determined, fearless. I straightened my shoulders and pushed back any emotion that had risen to the surface. I was this close to finding answers about this candy and why our uncle had ruthlessly handed us over to a vampire all those years ago, and I wasn't about to screw it up. Would I have rather had my brother by my side for this moment? Of course. But being here was like finally finding closure for him, for both of us. But it suddenly wasn't Hansel's face I saw flash in my mind when I thought about the choice I was about to make. Instead, I had a vision of life with Cole. He'd gotten under my skin, and for some reason, and even though I knew I had to deal with this threat, I was more disappointed at the thought of losing him than I expected. Maybe once I'd closed this chapter of my life, I could come back, try it all over again. It couldn't last forever because of what I was, but we could have decades together if we were lucky. What would that be like, to truly walk away from this life of revenge and sorrow, to have the answers I'd been seeking for more than a century? Would it bring peace? Or was the quest for answers the only thing holding my sanity together all these years? There was only one way to find out. I followed the girl in the purple dress out of the club a few hours later, keeping to the shadows the way only Hansel and I could. She managed to stumble her way down the sidewalk a block or two before the mysterious candy girl caught up to her. To any normal observer, it looked like a couple of BFFs taking care of each other after a little too much to drink. I followed them carefully, watching as they got into a dark blue SUV that appeared to have a few other victims inside. Multiple clubs. No wonder I hadn't seen them for a few days. They must have been hitting up multiple locations here in the city. Unfortunately, the windows were too dark to tell exactly who was in that vehicle. Was Wolfgang in there with them? Was he the leader of all this, or just some lackey passing out the candies? And why had he come back into my life now after all these years of searching? I quickly ran to my own car and followed them, something I was pretty good at, especially since I had ways of making my car practically invisible. The SUV made 2 more alleyway stops before finally pulling into a gated warehouse on the outskirts of the most dangerous neighborhood in the city. The whole area looked like a dumping ground, which I'll admit made it the perfect hideout. It looked like it had been abandoned except for the 5 expensive SUVs currently parked outside and a handful of lights shining from some of the windows. What kind of operation were they running here? And more importantly, how many vampires were hiding inside? There were at least 5 victims and 5 vampires inside the SUV by the time they pulled up to their final destination. Assuming the other 4 parked outside the loading dock had gone on a similar hunting trip tonight, that meant potentially 20 more vampires inside and 20 more victims to try to save before the night was over. But what if I was underestimating? What if an entire hive of vampires was in there feeding on the club victims? I shuddered and reached for my black case. I entered the code and reached for the weapon I knew I had to use tonight. Hansel's favorite dagger shone in the light from the lamppost overhead, and I lifted it from the case without a second thought. No, it wasn't my normal choice, and I hadn't practiced as much with this weapon over the years. But it was his, and I wanted some piece of him to be here with me tonight. He deserved that. This is for you, brother. And with that, I crept toward the warehouse and back into the world of vampire hunting. Chapter 4, The Hive. Vampires carried the limp bodies of their club victims through the back door of the warehouse. I had no way of knowing if they'd been given something else inside the vehicle or if the candy had finally made them pass out, but they were definitely better off that way. I knew from experience. When the group from the SUV had disappeared into the warehouse, I sat on the ground behind one of the vehicles and took a moment to center myself and connect to my energy. I no longer had access to all the tools Hansel and I used to have, but I still had the most important thing, my magic. I connected to the fire within me like sparking a match in the center of my heart. It had been nearly 2 years since I'd fully given into the power inside like this, and I gasped as it filled me. Damn, I'd miss this. My entire body lit up with the magic of my ancestors, mages who'd lived for hundreds of years fighting to maintain the balance between good and evil. For all I knew, I was one of the last mages alive in this world. I never should have abandoned this duty, but tonight I would do whatever it took to make it right again. When I opened my eyes, my vision was sharper. My hearing was more acute. Every movement of my body felt different, stronger, more graceful and precise. I cloaked my appearance, vanishing from sight, at least for anyone who didn't know how to look. Since mages weren't exactly commonplace these days, I was hoping none of the vampires inside would be tuned into the type of magical energy I gave off anyway. I didn't want to just walk straight through the door because while my body seemed invisible, the door itself would still move if I opened it. I needed a more hidden entryway, and it took me a good 10 minutes to find it. I slid in through a broken window on the east side of the building. There were no lights on in the room or the adjacent hallway, but I could see well enough to get around. Besides, I'd placed a magical trace on the woman in purple back at the club, and in here it was like a beacon to me. A kind of magical compass inside that told me exactly where to go and how far away she was at any given moment. She hadn't moved at all since I first stepped foot into the building, which likely meant they were holding her and all the other club victims in a room somewhere near the center of the warehouse. I cringed at the thought of what I might find when I got to that room, but I had no doubt I was going to have my work cut out for me before I made it there. It didn't take long to find the first group of them in a room, hovering over a set of documents spread across a table. From the hallway, I quickly went through the motions of a powerful battle rune I'd learned from an ancient mage about 100 years ago. It was the best spell I knew for paralyzing vampires so they couldn't make a sound or move a muscle. As long as I had the element of surprise on my side, it worked every time. And this was no exception. The entire group of 8 men froze, and I entered the room quickly and quietly, ending each of them with a single stab to the heart. I worked my way through the warehouse quickly and methodically, taking out smaller clusters of vampires in the various rooms, but seeing no sign of the victims just yet. The largest group of vamps seemed to be gathered in the warehouse entrance area. This must have been where they'd come in after arriving in their SUVs, and I caught sight of the woman who'd been passing out candy, standing next to a larger man in a suit. Still no sign of Wolfgang, which was starting to piss me off, but at least I was making progress. I counted 15 in all. Not exactly a cakewalk, but it wasn't the largest group I'd ever faced. I needed to act fast, though, because if I'd missed some along the way or anyone discovered the trail of dead vampires I'd left behind me, they'd be hunting me, instead of the other way around. I cast my rune spell one last time, covering an area large enough to trap at least 8 of the 15. That was going to have to be good enough. I kissed the H on the hilt of the dagger and said a little prayer before sneaking into the room, triggering the spell, and going after the remaining 7 vampires who were still mobile. My biggest mission here was to kill those 7 before anyone managed to get away or warn more of their kind that I was here. At first, my reactions were too slow as I tried to mix defensive moves with spells. One particularly nasty vampire with the strength of at least 10 brought me to the ground and nearly made a snack of my neck, but something inside me lit up as he lunged for me. "That's not how this works," I said, casting a barrier spell to protect my skin as I gathered fire into my palm and burnt the shit out of his arm. He screamed and sat up, a look of shock crossing his face as my dagger plunged into his heart. After that, I was back to the old me, the Gretel that knew how to kick vampire ass since she was just a little thing hiding in the woods. I tore through that room, spells flying as I downed them all one by one. When I was done, blood dripped from the edge of my dagger. I casually wiped it across the skirt of my black dress as I stared at the carnage. Thankfully, once a vampire was dead, it didn't take long for their body to decompose and turn to ash. It happened in a matter of seconds if they were exposed to the sun, but a dagger through the heart usually meant half an hour until their bodies were dust. Plenty of time to go searching for my woman in purple and the other victims from the club. I focused in on her energy and practically ran toward a door in the back of the large room. I whispered an incantation and placed my hand on the door, just in case someone had set it with a trap, but there was nothing here. Strange for a hive of vampires not at least to put some kind of trap on the door where they were hiding their most precious treasures. I closed my grip tighter on my weapon. Something didn't feel right, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I stepped into that room. More than 50 people, all dressed in club attire, lay passed out on grimy tables, their arms hooked up to lines that drained their blood into clear plastic bags. Coolers lined the walls, and I could only imagine how many of those bags were stored inside. But it wasn't the sheer number of victims that made me nearly drop my weapon. It was a single person chained to a chair in the center of the room, his mouth covered with a dirty piece of cloth, but his eyes met mine, and I knew that kind of terror. Like an idiot, my heart took over, and I ran to him without thinking. "Cole!" I shouted, but he shook his head violently, looking past my shoulder. I didn't even get close enough to touch him before something sliced through my calves. I'd run straight through some kind of trap. I fell to my knees and then tried to stand again, failing miserably as pain consumed me. Behind me, a woman laughed. This was not good. I slowly turned to her, my palms on the floor as I tried to push myself back up, nearly sliding on a pool of my own blood. "This was so much easier than I thought it would be," she said, her eyes practically glowing in the dim light. "The last of the mighty duo finally brought to her knees." I didn't recognize her, but she obviously knew who I was. And also, she knew that Hansel was gone. If I found out she had something to do with that, I was going to have fun putting an end to her life. The hive queen, if I had to guess, somehow she'd known I was going to be here tonight. I'd been too careless, sure that no one around knew who I was. "What do you want with me?" I asked. "Well, first, I'd like you to put that weapon on the floor and kick it toward me," she said. I didn't have much choice about that, seeing how I was literally on my knees with no ability to cast magic in this state, so I obeyed, feeling a little bit of my hope slip away with the dagger. She smiled, her fangs showing as she met my eyes. "And people said it would be hard to bring the two of you down." Every muscle in my body tensed. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked. Hansel had disappeared nearly 2 years ago on an entirely different continent. The way his room had looked when I found it made me believe there was no way he'd survived it. I'd searched for him for months, but I'd eventually given in to the truth. If this vampire had been any part of that, I wanted her dead, and I wanted it to hurt. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into all the details right now. Since you took it upon yourself to kill half my hive, it's time for me to get the hell out of this city before someone a lot more dangerous than you figures out what we've been doing here," she said. "But don't worry, you'll be coming with me. I can't wait to tell you all about what your brother went through that night." I couldn't tell yet if she was bluffing about Hansel, but she'd at least admitted she didn't plan on killing me tonight. She wanted to take me with her. But why? What use could a mage be to a vampire? And more importantly, what did she plan to do with Cole and the others once we left? I'd basically been on borrowed time ever since I lost Hansel, but Cole? I'd never meant to drag him into this world. I couldn't let anything happen to him. "Who are you?" I asked, hoping to stall her long enough to think of a way out of this. She narrowed her eyes and shook her head as if she could read my mind. And with vampires, you honestly never knew. Either way, she wasn't about to answer any of my questions here. "Come along without a fight, and I will promise not to harm your boyfriend or any of the people here," she said. "And how do you know I can trust you not to light this whole place on fire as soon as we're out of it?" I asked. "I may not know who you are, but you're a vampire, and vampires can't be trusted." "What choice do you have?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "If you try to fight me on this, I'll kill every human in this room. And the man you seem to care so much about? I'll make him suffer beyond anything he's ever imagined, while you watch. Those are your only choices, so I suggest you come with me now, and I'll tell you everything you want to know on the way to our next location." I shrugged. "Or I could just kill you and save everyone, including Cole," I said, glancing at the dagger and wondering if I had enough power to take this vamp on my own. Queens were never easy, and there were more than a few that nearly took Hansel and me down when we were working at our best. But she was right. What choice did I have? She laughed again, and as her head tilted back, I fought against the pain and gathered my magic inside my belly, ready to make my move. Only I never got the chance. Hansel's dagger flew through the air, and before I could wrap my mind around what was happening, the silver tip of it pierced through the vampire's chest from behind. She stumbled forward, eyes wide, hands clawing at her chest as she fell to the floor in front of me, revealing the man standing behind her. His eyes locked on my face in pure shock. "What the hell are you doing here?" I asked, standing to wrench the weapon from the queen's dead body. I winced at the pain, but didn't want him to see my weakness. Wolfgang threw his arms wide, lifting his hands up in surrender. There were tears in his eyes. "My dearest Gretel," he said, shaking his head, "you have no idea how long I've been searching for you." I swallowed and kept the dagger raised, completely confused. "What are you talking about?" I shouted. "You drugged us and left us for that vampire to torture us. We were just children. We trusted you." He put a hand on his heart, his eyes never once leaving mine. "I swear to you on my life I did no such thing," he said. "The candy I gave you was meant to mask your powers so that the vampires who were looking for you both would never find you. They were coming there that night for me, Gretel. As an alchemist, they knew I could help them lure and control humans, but I didn't want them to have you and your brother. So I took you out into the woods far from the village where I thought you would be safe. You should have been okay, but you came back. Somehow you found your way home too soon." I shook my head, trying to make sense of all the mixed-up fragments of memory in my mind. The pebbles? Had we used them that night? "No, that's not how it happened," I shouted. But I wasn't so sure anymore. "You gave us the candy and then took us to that vampire's house." "Gretel, you have to believe me. I would never have done that to you," he said. "Leaving the two of you behind after I'd promised my sister to look after you was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. You have no idea how much it nearly killed me when you reappeared at the house so soon. The vampires took you, and I thought they'd killed you both all those years ago. But then I started to hear about the work you were doing, your mother's work. You were following in her footsteps even though you had no idea about her life back then before she was taken from us. She would have been proud of you both, Gretel." I closed my eyes, and suddenly a piece of memory that had never made sense to me came rushing back. It slid into place like a puzzle piece, turning my whole life upside down. He was telling the truth. Hansel and I had come back to the village. We'd followed the white pebbles from Hansel's magic pouch, the one Mother had made for him before she died. The vampire had grabbed us there at the edge of the village near our home. I'd forgotten it until this moment. "You never betrayed us?" I asked softly, tears stinging my eyes. Uncle Wolfgang stepped forward and threw his arms around me. "Gretel, I have always loved you," he said. "I have spent my whole life trying to find you again and make it up to you after what happened that night." I stared down at the decaying corpse of the vampire queen. "Then what in the world are you doing working for these guys? I saw you at the club the other night, and I know this is your creation," I said, pulling a candy out of my pocket. "Why are you making this for them?" To my surprise, he smiled through his tears as he put a hand over mine. "Because they caught me following you," he said. "They promised not to harm you or even interfere in your life as long as I made them the candies. I didn't want to do it, but I hope you can see that I would do anything to protect the people I love." Which suddenly made me remember that I had someone else I loved who was currently chained to a chair behind me, most likely freaking out about everything he'd just witnessed in this room. I quickly turned to him and ran, muttering a simple spell to free him from the chains. I pulled the cloth away from his mouth and put my hands on his. "Cole, I never wanted to drag you into this," I said. "I know what you must be thinking right now, and I promise you I'm going to explain everything. But before I could say another word, he pulled me into a kiss. "I love you, Maggie. Gretel, whatever your name is. he said, a partial smile tugging at his mouth as he searched my eyes. And yes, you have a lot of explaining to do when all this is over. You never even told me you had a brother. I laughed. Out of all that happened tonight, that's the thing you're shocked about right now? I hate to break up this lovely reunion, but we need to get out of here before more of those vampires arrive and see what we did to their leader, Wolfgang said. He tossed me a clear vial and told me to put it on my wounds. The salve acted fast, and though I had a feeling the cuts from the trap might leave scars, the pain was gone for now. What are we going to do about all these humans? There were way too many of them to get them all home, and we couldn't very well just leave them here. We'll have to call the police, Wolfgang said. Hopefully, they'll arrive before any of the other vampires. I sighed. Not exactly ideal, but maybe we could stick around outside and watch the place until the cops arrived. Okay, you call them. I'm going to look around for a minute and see if I can find any clues here about this hive and where their headquarters are, I said. Do any of the other hives have access to these candies of yours? Wolfgang nodded. I'm sorry, but yes, he said. They've had me making batches for at least 3 other hives. If we can find their headquarters, I'm sure we can hunt down these other hives as well. Okay, then call the police and we'll clean up any evidence of magic, I said. Cole, you're with me. He smiled and grabbed my hand. What are you smiling at? I asked as I led him toward the room where I'd seen those documents earlier. You found out your girlfriend is some kind of magical being, that vampires are real, and you literally almost died tonight. You shouldn't be so happy right now. He laughed. I always knew there was something special about you, but you were always hiding from me. No matter how hard I tried, it was like you would never let me in, he said, pausing to pull me into his arms again. Vampires and death aside, it's just really nice to see the real you. You're even more amazing than I imagined. We kissed again, and I realized it was the first time in my immortal life I'd actually kissed someone I loved who knew the truth of who I was. He was right. It was nice. But we would have plenty of time to talk later. I needed to search this place and get us both the hell out of here. I led him to the room where I'd killed those first vampires, and as I was going through the documents, Cole crouched down on the floor and came up with something white and shining in his fingertips. What's this? He asked. One glance at it, and I felt as though the entire world had come alive again. I brought a hand to my lips, suddenly finding it hard to breathe. Let me see that, I said, holding out a trembling hand. Cole placed the smooth pebble in my palm, and I turned it over twice, laughing through my tears, when I saw the letter H engraved on the side. There was only one way a stone like that could have made its way into this room. My brother was still alive, and somehow he'd managed to leave a trail for me to follow. What is it? Cole asked. I smiled and held the pebble to my heart. A breadcrumb. So, short story where I feel, as always, that there's so much more that I would love to write about this. I would love to show Gretel kicking some butt with her human boyfriend, going after Hansel, fighting the rest of the vampires. It would be so much fun. Part of the danger of being a writer is that you always have more and more and more ideas. And in a lifetime, there's no way you could ever truly write them all. But I hope that you enjoyed this little peek into my mind, into the fun of what you can do with an old but good fairy tale that you loved as a child and kind of reimagining it as something new. So if you enjoyed it, I would love for you to join my newsletter list where you can get a copy of this story along with all of the other short stories that I've written in The Witching Well and Other Stories. It's a free anthology box set that I have put together exclusively for my newsletter subscribers. So subscribe now. You can get some fun emails about me and some behind the scenes, and you'll be able to download that free short story box set. the Once Upon anthologies that this story and several of my other stories showed up in are actually being taken down. So after I think October ends, you will no longer see those books. So if you want to get the anthology that this was in, I believe all of them are on sale right now for 99 cents. So it has Ella in the Haunted House and all these other ones. Now you'll get my free stories anyway in the anthology, but if you want to get introduced to other authors like me and their series and some of their writing, it's a great way to get a taste of some of my friends and favorite authors that I know you will love. So I will leave a link to all those different anthologies down below because they will be gone soon and never to return. After that, there will be no way to get these short stories of mine other than by joining my newsletter list. So I would love to see you on there for sure. Also, as a freebie here for day 2 of our Spooktacular, I am giving everybody a free ebook copy of my book, The Witch's Key. So The Witch's Key is what really kicked off my readings here on YouTube. And you can still go and watch not only The Witch's Key being read live as I was writing it during the pandemic in 2020, but you can also hear me read all 6 books of the first half of my Shadow Demons Saga live here on YouTube. So those playlists are all here on my playlists on my YouTube channel. And you can also find some of my other short stories read aloud here. So if you enjoy hearing me read, go check those out as well. Most of the time, if you look at the pinned comment underneath the video, you'll find a timestamp where the reading begins if you want to skip some of the chatty stuff. But the chatty stuff is fun too. But if you have not yet read The Witch's Key, or if you were around when I was reading it, but you weren't able to buy a copy of the ebook, you can grab it free, and hopefully praying so much that sometime in 2023, once The Disappearance of Vanessa Shaw and book 12 of my Shadow Demons Saga are finished and published, I will be able to get back to not only my Eternal Sorrows series, which we're going to talk about more during the Spooktacular, but also The Witch's Key, which I intend to continue reading live here on YouTube. So if you enjoy these readings, go ahead and subscribe. I'm getting very close to 9,000 subscribers, so I would love to see a few new subscribers pop in today. And make sure that you like this video and comment down below. If you loved it, be sure to share it with friends, and we've got so many more giveaways. So if you want to grab that free copy of The Witch's Key, there is a book funnel link down below and on my blog today. I'm also giving away 15 Shadow Demons World paperbacks, all signed by me, and I will send them anywhere in the world that I'm able to send. So totally open to international, because I love my international fans, and I know you guys get excluded from a lot of giveaways like this. So I'm opening it up to everybody, and that giveaway is our grand prize for the Spooktacular. So you will be able to enter anytime between now and October 31st when we will choose a winner. Tomorrow we have a live coffee chat coming up at 4 p.m. here on YouTube, and we have some more giveaways and fun events coming up as well, including a virtual book signing. So this will be the first time ever in my entire career, 12 full years of being an author, that I have offered every single one of my books available as a signed paperback. So you'll be able to get a form to fill out tomorrow, starting tomorrow, and you'll have a few days to put your order in for any set of books. And I can't promise they'll be there before Christmas, because it will depend how quickly the printer ships them to me, but I will do my best to get them out to you for the holidays. So if you're looking for a good holiday gift, this might be a good start for yourself or for a friend. So be sure to join me for the virtual book fair tomorrow. The actual order event will be going on inside a Facebook group where there are other authors, including New York Times bestselling Melissa Marr, Nikki Jefford, and lots of other authors will be signing in there as well. If you want to pop in and check it out, all those links will be down below or over on my blog at sarahcannon.com/blog. Or if you just are interested in my books, you'll find those on the blog as well. Okay, that's it for today. I super love you guys. Come join my newsletter, come hang out, join this YouTube channel, and we've got lots more fun to come as the Spooktacular continues. So I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye.